Welcome back to the Catholics Against Militarism podcast. I'm honored to welcome here today three Catholic activists who were involved in the Kings Bay Plowshares movement in 2018. Martha Hennessy, I'm sorry, is it Carmen Trotta? Is that how you say your?
Trotta.
Trotta, okay, Carmen Trotta and Clare Grady. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
All right, so I wanted to start out this podcast with a little story. A few years ago, I was doing a conference at my Catholic church in Atlanta with Father McCarthy, who was coming in to do a retreat on nonviolence. And he's been on my podcast before, so my listeners are familiar with him. And I invited a friend of mine. He was a man in his 30s, about my age. His name was, we'll call him Jay. And he looked at the brochure and he said, "What is this, Ellen? Are you one of these liberal, kumbaya, anti-war social justice Catholics?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean by that, Jay? Are you one of these National Review flag-waving Opus Dei Catholics?" And we both looked at each other with some suspicion and walked away. And I saw my friend Jay another 2 weeks later, and I said, "Hey, did you get a chance to check out the conference that I'm putting on with Father McCarthy? Are you going to come?" And he said, "I don't think I'm going to come, Ellen." And I said, "Well, why not? I'm just curious. That's okay, but why don't you want to come?" And he said, "I think that all those hippies, those baby boomer Catholic hippies from the early 80s who were involved in the anti-nuclear movement have been proven wrong by history. They were on the wrong side of history. And we know that now, because if Ronald Reagan had not built up our nuclear armaments, we would not have won the Cold War." And at that point, I really didn't know what to say to him. There were so many things running through my mind. But we went our separate ways. He did not come to the conference, but we're still friends today. And so I'm going to send him this podcast, and I'm going to say, "Remember that conversation we had 4 or 5 years ago? I want you to meet these people, and I want you to hear what they have to say." And so I just wanted to start the podcast with that story because I feel like it represents a common mentality among not just American Catholics, but a lot of Americans. So the reason that I invited Martha, Carmen, and Claire on the podcast today is because on April 4th of 2018, they illegally entered the Kings Bay Naval Submarine Base in St. Mary's, Georgia, and they symbolically disarmed the nuclear weapons there. So we're going to talk about what that means to symbolically disarm nuclear weapons. We're going to talk about why they did what they did, and what you all can do as listeners to help their cause and to help them. But first of all, can we talk a little bit about who you are? Would you mind introducing yourselves with a brief bio and tell us what you think is important for the listeners to know? Martha, do you want to go first?
Thank you. So I'm 64 years old. I come from a family of 9 children. I was born into the Catholic worker movement. I worked for 25 years as an occupational therapist. I have 3 children and 9 grandchildren. And I volunteer part-time at the Mary House Catholic Worker, the Mother House, where my grandmother, Dorothy Day, lived and died the last 5 years of her life. And I have been working with anti-war issues since I was a teenager. My brother was sent to Vietnam, and we protested the Vietnam War.
Great. Thank you.
So, Carmen Trotta, from suburban Long Island, Irish-Italian family. There were 7 of us. I was really, I think that my childhood, the problem of my childhood is I'm a child really of the war in Vietnam, and I'm a child of the Cold War. And I wanted desperately to understand as a child who was right and wrong regarding the war in Vietnam. And it really wasn't until I became a religious studies major in college. I had had a fantastic preacher who became my academic advisor. It was he who would ultimately sort of turn me on to or direct me to the Catholic Worker. It was he giving me Martin Luther King's Beyond Vietnam speech that was that Martin Luther King leveled with the American people and made the case very clearly about the war in Vietnam and who was right and wrong. The line that struck me that remains with me to this day is that by 1954, the United States was paying for 80% of the French effort, which was a colonial effort, which meant that the United States going into Vietnam had no better motive for it than that. And so that was the energy which I left college with and went to the Catholic Worker in Des Moines with. And so it's been since then 30-something years in the enhanced environment that is the Catholic Worker as regards nuclear abolition and resistance to war. So,
Great,
yeah.
thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, so I kind of like the sequence here. Martha's one of 9, Carmen's one of 7, I'm one of 5 from an Irish Catholic family. My grandparents are from the west coast of Ireland, and that was a big part of who we were and are as a family. One of my sisters is going over there yet again because the kids do Irish music. And anyway, so this Catholic and Irish part and my parents.
Sorry, my cat was getting into a paper bag. I'm sorry.
I love that.
Please continue.
It's like a Holy Spirit moment. Cat and the bag. Let me see what was I saying that wasn't really that important?
You were talking about Ireland. I'm sorry.
Ireland and Catholic, and that's sort of the foundation of parents coming together on those two things. And they raised us with Dan and Phil Berrigan sort of like uncles. And so they met, like my father and Phil met in 1956, the night that my oldest sister was born. And we would have mass at the house where we lived in the Bronx. We grew up in the Bronx till I was in high school. And so my father and mother were involved in anti-racial work and then, I mean, racial justice work, I guess is a better way to say that. And I guess civil rights is what it was called at the time. And then anti-war work. And my father was part of the Camden 28, where they destroyed draft files. And they went to trial. So that action was in 1970, 71, and the trial was in 73. Keep getting dates a little bit off. Anyway, they had several months of a trial. 17 of them were on trial at once. And they were acquitted. So I noticed when you first introduced our action, Ellen, you called it illegally entering. And I think that that's a matter of perspective. And no, it's okay. It's good that you brought it up like that. I think you're creating the conversation, and it's good and it's juicy. But in any case, the jury that acquitted the Camden 28 basically supported the defendants who said it's better to destroy paper than children. Right? And that's a lineage that I really value. That's a Catholic that I like, that the Prince of Peace is alive when we act like Jesus did in the moment for the human person, which carries the divine, right? And yes. So but we have all these places where we get stuck in being truly human and loving. And this piece about war. I'm so excited to know you even have a blog and that you're working with Catholics against war, because I feel like our church is needing a lot of help with that. I mean, not the teachings of Jesus, but the way the institutional church sort of shares it. And I've been going to mass at my local parish in Ithaca, where I raised Paul and I have 2 daughters, and I raised them going to church where grandma and grandpa and everybody, all the siblings would go. And at 30 years of going to mass there, one time did we talk about the 5th commandment. And then 1 hour of the 5 sessions did we get to talk about war, and they only taught us about the just war theory, not about pacem in terris or gospel teaching on nonviolence, nothing about it. So on the parish level, kind of like starving. And we asked, like, we study pacem in terris. So we asked, like, I'm running far afield from family now, but my heart hurts for our church and the need to reconcile the good news of the Prince of Peace and how we are living in a very privileged position in the biggest empire on the planet today with the biggest, deadliest weapons on the planet.
Yes, amen to that, Claire. And the word illegal is interesting because there's civil law and then there's divine law, right? So there's lots of different laws.
Not merely that. We brought on an indictment when we went onto the base. They accused us of a criminal conspiracy and getting together and going onto that base. The larger criminal conspiracy, the real criminal conspiracy, is the retention, deployment, and caretaking of the Trident missile submarine.
Okay, let's talk about that, because I don't think that many people in my audience know who you guys are and what you're doing. Part of the reason for that is because I feel like nobody in the church, like, it's amazing to me that people like you are out there doing these things, Catholics, strong, faithful people, and we don't hear anything about it. So first of all, tell me what you did on April 4th, 2018, and then tell me a little bit about the Plowshares movement, because I want my listeners to know that this was not an isolated incident, that 7 random people just decided to do. There's a long tradition of this, a 40-year tradition, and I didn't know about that until like 5 years ago, and I'm like 41 now. So nobody knows about these things well, I don't want to say nobody, but not many people of my generation know about it, and certainly the millennials, I don't feel like this is getting passed down to them at all. So tell me what you did on April 4th of 2018. What did you do that has you in so much trouble?
Well, the tradition of the Plowshares movement is that of following what was given to us in Isaiah 2:4. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and study war no more. And the Berrigan brothers were very much censored by the U.S. Catholic Church in their times once it became clear that they were connecting all the dots about empire and war and racism. Thanks to the help with Martin Luther King Jr. as well. And we traditionally have the sacramental act of pouring blood as an act of contrition and a way of seeking forgiveness for the sin of these weapons. And we posted an indictment citing international law, Nuremberg Principles, the U.S. Constitution. We also left the book, The Doomsday Machine by Dan Ellsberg, on the site. And we symbolically hammered on a nuclear missile, we called it a shrine. It's a display site for tourists to visit. So the symbolic disarmament comes with the pouring of blood, the hammering.
Okay, great.
So, yeah, notably, we did go in the night and we clipped a lock and we went through a little fence and we walked under the moonlight and we went to these places in Carmen. Maybe you'd like to talk about where you went.
Well, myself and Liz McAllister, who's the founder of the Plowshares movement, and the Jesuit priest, Father Steve Kelly, we went into what is considered a lethal force area. Which is, in almost every case, this is what the Plowshares look to do. They actually do look to get to the weapon system and to do some slight bit of damage so that we are initiating the process that the prophet Isaiah called for, to beat swords into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks. Nations not making war against nations ever again, nor will they study war anymore. And actually we did it very slowly. We understood that being in a lethal force zone, you don't want to move too quickly. You want to be clear that that you're a nonviolent presence. So we cut the concertina wire. I did. That was the first barrier. And then we took a banner that said nuclear weapons illegal, immoral. And then we went to the fence line and we cut the fence line enough so that we could crawl through. But before we crawled through, we took another picture of ourselves with that banner that said immoral and illegal. And then we went into what was the lethal force area, and There was another large, highly electrified fence, at least it looked like that, very complicated. And for a while we held our banner, we prayed some, and at this point we had gone completely undetected. I should say that we walked for over an hour on the base. We didn't walk through the bushes, we walked on what was occasionally a lit road for an hour, and we went undetected. And then we decided actually to try, we were going to try and cut the fence with the bolt cutters. And because we had the rubber handles on them, so it wouldn't, I don't think anyone would have gotten hurt. And as we were going to try it, lights suddenly went on, and you could see a number of vehicles mobilizing to come toward us. And yeah, and when the soldiers came, we had planned what we were going to say. And if I can remember it briefly, we said to them that we come in peace, that we are unarmed, that we are all American citizens. And there was one other point that we made.
Did you offer them bread too? For some reason, I remember reading something about that. Offering them bread. It was not, we did not offer them bread. We offered them to read them the indictment. They wanted nothing to do with that. They were so incredibly young. They were very, very young. It was like children came out of the thing. And I don't mean to belittle them at all. In fact, I have gratitude for the way that they actually treated us. And they came with their guns pointed not at us, at the ground. And, okay.
And then they waited we had to wait for a very long time. Well, a very long time. I shouldn't say that. It had to be 20 minutes that they came, and they were the only people there. And they literally did not seem to know what to do. We were on the other side of a fence, and they didn't know what to do. And we just stood there and tried to talk to them some. And then finally, behind us, truck after truck, there had to be 9 vehicles pulled up, and soldiers started running out of the trucks. And then they came into the lethal force area themselves, trained their guns on us, and laid us down on the not cobblestone, bluestone. And they were very, I'll tell you, they were decent about it. They didn't, they had us ultimately lay down, curl up into a ball. They lifted us up. I thought when they laid down, they would come back and I was going to get a knee in my back, and I did not.
Okay.
They were decent to us in that way.
Okay. Okay. And this was done on April 4th, 2018 for a specific reason. You chose that date. It was very symbolic. Could you explain why you chose that date?
It's the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King, who should be considered America's premier
prophet.
No, I was not going to say prophet. I was going to say martyr, Christian martyr.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Notably, it's also the anniversary of the deliverance of the Beyond Vietnam speech at Riverside on April 4th, the year before he was killed. So,
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so it has many layers to it. It's also the date of one of the U.S. Invasions and bombardment and slaughters in Fallujah, Iraq. Anyway,
wow.
More to talk about that date.
Right. Wow. That's an important date. And I know a lot of people think it was because he gave that speech and he started speaking out against militarism and war that he was assassinated ultimately. And there was we have to acknowledge too.
Today.
Sorry?
Where he came out with the line that the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. And that's been true every day of my life.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that as well. And we can't move on without mentioning too the civil trial that took place in, I believe, 1999 that proved that there was a government conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King, which so few people know about. But so that was a very important date. And tell me a little bit about the place, the Kings Bay Naval Station. Out of all the military bases, why did you choose that one?
If I'm correct, I believe that a quarter of our nuclear arsenal is on the Trident submarine. There are 8 Trident submarines that get taken care of at that base, and then over on the west coast, what's the name of that station?
Kitsap in Puget Sound.
There's another one that is of equal weight. So Between them, they are about half of America's nuclear arsenal. So a quarter of America's nuclear arsenal is at that base in Georgia. And so
and you could walk right up to it for like an hour without anybody noticing you. Like, that just kind of blows my mind right there. That
it's a large campus. It's 17,000 acres.
Okay. So you chose that place, and you are in Georgia right now, together in Georgia right now. What are you doing there right now?
We're in New York City.
Oh, I thought you were in Georgia this weekend.
We're on our way to Georgia. Tomorrow morning we fly together.
Okay. What are you doing down there next week in Georgia?
Next week we have perhaps the last pretrial hearing before going to trial. It's called oral arguments, and we're in the last stages of motions to dismiss the charges. And we presented last summer 4 points to dismiss the charges, and perhaps the biggest one was on freedom of religion, the Freedom of Religion Restoration Act from the 1990s. Is a new thing that we realized with the help of a wonderful Catholic lawyer, that even though we didn't act because of that act, that we actually meet the criteria of people who act as, this is our religious practice. We have firmly held religious beliefs, and doing nonviolent symbolic disarmament at this nuclear subbase is part of our practice. And so we will be arguing, they call it arguing, not a bad thing, presenting our case, and basically saying that the government, because of the nature of the law, RFRA, is supposed to consider people's practice of their religion with great care, and they're supposed to identify what governmental interests there are, and then see if they can make an exception for you to practice your religion and not violate, or rather not compromise their interests. And if they do think that they don't want to make an exception, they're supposed to use the least restrictive means possible in deterring you, or rather in restricting you in practicing your religion. So what we're saying is giving us 3 felonies and a misdemeanor right off the bat for going with this very nonviolent posture, which was not threatening, and the base said no one was harmed and no national defense instruments were in danger, but they gave us 3 felonies and a misdemeanor, so we faced 20 years in prison. That's not the least restrictive response they could make to these religious practitioners who came nonviolently to the base.
Okay. What were the 3 felonies that you were charged with?
Conspiracy, depredation, and destruction of property.
Okay.
Trespass.
Oh, trespassing, of course. Okay, so this is I'm just kind of amazed that that you would put your freedom on the line to do something like this. It seems to me that most of the time we associate these kinds of actions with younger people, college students, people who don't have families, don't have grandchildren, who have a lot less to lose. And I was just wondering, you know, it's almost like embarrassing to me as a Gen Xer that like we never did anything like this. And I don't know why that is. Maybe we all just grew up in this world of of nuclear arms, this nuclear age. So it's like water is to a fish. Like we just don't notice that it's there. And maybe, and as being in your generation, you're a little closer to the beginning of that age. And I don't know, but it's just astounding to me that you guys all have careers and families, and you're putting that on the line, and you could go to jail for decades. So why did you do this? Why didn't you just vote a certain way, or stand on a street corner with signs and said honk for peace? I mean, you guys could have done something that was a lot easier.
We've been doing that for decades. We've been standing, and we've been vigiling, and we've been fasting, and we've been praying, and we've been letter writing, and we've been petitioning our government. For myself, it was a question of taking it to the next level, especially in light of the traveling that I had recently done to South Korea and to Russia. And the way things are going now under the current administration, we want to make these weapons usable. And, you know, at my age, I figured it was time for me to up the ante, and I could afford to do that. But I must say that it took a significant amount of preparation throughout my lifetime.
Well, that's important to keep in mind. This is an outgrowth of your whole life's work in activism and prayer. Yeah, go ahead, Carmen.
This is a whole life's work. I say to everyone, it's interesting to know that 4 of the 7 of us, and 7 of the 7 of us, were all deeply concerned about the United States' use of torture, a war crime, at Guantanamo. 4 of us went down to forbidden Cuba, and at a time when the prisoners were on hunger strike, in order to call attention to that. Unfortunately, the Roman Catholic Church really did not support its own teaching, whereby torture is considered intrinsically evil. It can never be used without being a form of evil, and something that should be avoided. And that was quite a long campaign over a period of years, but that campaign has been part of a series of other campaigns, including right now the conflict in Yemen. And there is, via the Catholic Worker here in New York City, there is an ongoing vigil that occurs weekly regarding Yemen. Again, war crimes being committed by the United States. For a fair portion of the war, or the larger portion of the war, and probably still to this day, the United States is refueling the Saudi fighter jets in midair. There are black site prisons run by the United Arab Emirates that the United States supports. We admit that we're not torturing people. The United States people do not do the torturing. We allow the mercenaries to torture them. We then interrogate them. If you go through this long enough and you realize that this is actually part of what America has become, a nation that has absolved itself of war crimes, a nation that has pulled out almost entirely from international law. Now, what more can you do? At some point, we were having this discussion earlier in the day. At some point, you find yourself guilty. You feel guilty of it yourself. That silence is complicity. If someone doesn't begin to speak out about what we are doing, where is the Catholic Church right now speaking out about the children that we have in cages? Do we pray for those children at Mass? No, it never comes up at Mass. And so at some point, you know, you grow up in a community where there is a sort of ongoing resistance, and really the taproot of violence, which is, who was the priest that said that? Was it McCarthy? McSorley. Was that nuclear weapons are the taproot of violence. That in a certain way it is symbolic of our daily use of nuclear weapons is symbolically, you know, it's the United States.
Right. Yeah. I read something in your statement. I think you said that nuclear weapons are the ultimate logic of the delusions to which we as a nation are addicted. Delusions, like we're deluding ourselves. What are those delusions, do you think?
Freedom, peace, and democracy.
Security. This whole thing of security is actually a shroud for exploitation of resources.
The war in Yemen is more about the war in Yemen, Afghanistan, Iraq. This is more about Western capitalism than it is. The Iraqis didn't have nuclear weapons. The Afghanis weren't the great participants in 9/11. There is no reason whatsoever for us to try and destroy the state of Yemen, except that Yemen has massive oil resources, gold resources, fisheries. So it's Western capitalism.
So in our statement, Ellen, we talk about the triplets that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King identified. The triplets: racism, militarism, and extreme materialism, which I can translate for myself as white supremacy, capitalism, and militarism. And the delusion, when I hear the word delusion, I think of that phenomenon of projection. So all the things that we're calling other people, terrorists, criminals, we ourselves would do well to look at our behavior as a nation. I see these weapons. Carmen was quoting Father Richard McSorley, who said these are the taproot of all violence. And in our statement, I think we say that in another way, which is like they're the ultimate bully stick, and they are used every day. It's Ellsberg that says this, like a cocked gun to the head of the planet. So even if you never pull that trigger, you're using that gun every day in the same way a bully does when you're the biggest bully on the block or whatever, because you have the biggest weapons. And as Martha is saying, that these weapons are used basically a extortion for resource globally. And if your listeners want to just have an honest look at the map of the globe, the United States has between 700 and 1,000 military bases in the world, right? And weaponized space. So they're like, wait a minute, who do we point the finger at now? Like, is it still Russia and China, or do we have a moment's reflection of healthy spiritual practice of saying, what am I doing? So I would say this wonderful tradition of nonviolent symbolic action that the Plowshares is in goes way back to gospel nonviolence, but that it is a communal effort. Martha is describing her childhood and Carmen's life here. Our lives are part of doing the works of mercy. And it is from that geography that we look at this unacceptable sin of stealing the world's resources, bullying and terrorizing, and killing. So I call it simply killing millions and stealing trillions. And that's the crime.
And
that's the crime.
And still not be satisfied and satiated.
Right. It is just like any addiction, that it's going to tell you you're the good guy and someone else is the bad guy. And the more you pursue that logic, literally with these tridents, you will be destroying the planet with that kind of logic.
Yeah, I remember a meme comes to mind that's been going around the internet, and it's a map of the Middle East, and it says, what is Iran doing putting their country right in the middle of all of our military bases? What right did they have to put their country there? They're clearly aggressors, right? You
mentioned Iran, and how many Americans know that the United States overthrew the democratically elected government in Iran in 1954?
I want to do a whole different podcast about that because, yeah, it's like there's so many topics here that we could just do a whole separate show on. And if you would like to come back, Carmen, and talk about that, I'd love to have you. But yeah, these things are things that people don't really understand, don't really know. I think what I've heard a lot said by other Catholics is they've been killing each other over there in the Middle East for thousands of years. This is nothing new.
That's racist.
Right. It seems like it's just, I can't unpack that right now, but it just strikes me as being like so dismissive of everything we've done to perpetuate. And you could even tie in the whole immigration thing. Everyone is so upset about immigration right now, but nobody ever talks about the connection between that and the militarism and the war that has caused these people to have to flee their countries. Anyway, we're getting off topic a bit, but thinking back to my friend Jay, when he seemed to think that the Cold War had been won and that the whole nuclear issue was a thing of the past, I think I read on your website somewhere something like $1.2 trillion is being planned right now for the development and the development of nuclear weapons, the modernization of nuclear weapons over the next 30 years. So the idea that this is a thing that ended in the early 90s is a joke, right? I mean, it's still going on.
Well, it certainly bankrupted Russia, and it will bankrupt us at a certain point.
I suppose that word bankrupt is really apt for our spiritual state when we spend so much money on weapons of death and destruction instead of life-giving things.
Right.
There was a moment in time, so the Non-Proliferation Treaty comes out in '68, I think it's ratified in 1970, and the nuclear powers have agreed to taper down nuclear weapons to zero and put them under international control. And then there was, during, oddly enough, the Reagan administration, between Reagan and Gorbachev, with the failure of with the demise, the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a period of time when we vastly reduced nuclear stockpiles, wanted to put them under some form of control, and promised Russia that we would not encroach upon Russia any further than had already been the case. However, I should mention also that the Reagan administration was offered by Gorbachev total nuclear disarmament. And Ronald Reagan almost bit, but I think the military-industrial complex got to him because we wanted Star Wars, full spectrum dominance. So the United States, we could have already had total nuclear disarmament. But then what did we do shortly after after the Herbert Bush administration? In 1999, NATO accepts the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. In 2004, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia become members of NATO. In 2009, Albania and Croatia. In 2017, Montenegro. And now we're looking at Georgia, the Ukraine are on the table. So we have surrounded Russia, we have provoked a new Cold War. And we see that every day now.
Right. Thank you for explaining that, Carmen. So I know you guys are on curfew, so you can't stay out too late. So let's, a couple more questions before we finish. Where does your trial stand now? When is your trial happening? When will that all come to, when will your fate be decided, basically, I guess?
Well, we've been 16 months post-action, and 3 of us have remained in the county jail for that period of time. We still do not have a trial date. We are expecting the judge to set a trial date with this oral hearing next week, but we have a sense that the Department of Justice doesn't want to see a trial where we air the facts about the nuclear arsenal.
I see. Okay.
And so in this time, you should know, and we're very grateful when we go down to Kathy Kelly, Sarah Cool, your sister. There's 80 people coming down with us as we go to this oral hearing. And oddly enough, the oral hearing's on August 7th. The bombing of Hiroshima is August 6th. Nagasaki's August 9th. And it may kick back into shape the Pax Christi group down in Georgia that had been mobilizing at that base for years. So we're happy to report that. I thought it would be worthy of mention.
Right. So go ahead, Claire. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, I guess I was glad that they're going at the same time that we have this hearing, and yet they're making the focus about the base, about the weapon. So they're kind of, yeah, like Carmen said, generating this energy that has been much appreciated at that spot. It feels important at this point to say that today the United States is not renewing the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, and that has huge consequences for the planet and the international community. But your listeners can look that up. And look up the website for ICAN. That's the group that is working globally to abolish nuclear weapons and the arms race. You'll find lots of good information on the ICAN website, ICAN.
Okay, I'll definitely link to that. I'm also going to send people to your website, kingsbayplowshares.org. I'll link to that as well. You can find a lot of great information about this issue, and you can read their statement, which is just brilliant. There's the vigil next week. Is anybody invited to that and to come out and?
Everyone is invited to that.
No one, what'd you say?
Everyone is invited to that.
Okay, where is it happening and when? Can you just tell me one more time?
At the Stimson Gate at the base down in Georgia.
Okay, and on what day?
A vigil August 6th at the gate, a vigil at the courthouse August 7th, and another vigil at the gate August 9th. It's on the website.
It's on the website. You can find that there. If you're in Georgia and you want to support them, please go. Is somebody from your group going to be at Busboys and Poets soon in Washington, D.C.?
Yes, we'll be speaking there on Sunday, August 11th from 5 to 7 p.m.
Okay, so if you're in the D.C. area, you can come meet Martha, Carmen, and Claire. Carmen, were you going to say something?
I do. I think it was good for your friend in terms of why now, there's at this point, there's really, since our action, there's been an enormous uptick in nuclear activity, but there are technical advances. It is contrary really to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but we've done a great deal that's contrary to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But so, for instance, the enhancing the weapon systems that we have would be a violation of that treaty, and we've done so serially. But so Hans Christensen from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists says that 10 years ago, 20% of the weapons fired out of the Trident submarines could hit a hard target, meaning a nuclear silo in Russia, and knock out that weapon. 20%. 10 years later, they've gotten to the point where 100% of the time we can target Russian missiles in their nuclear silos, which means that the tension rises enormously. If a single nuclear weapon, or if something is misperceived as a nuclear weapon, the amount of time they will have to recognize that and respond. And so you get into that situation where you could have an all-out exchange, nuclear exchange, which at this point, because of what we now know regarding a nuclear winter, that our knowledge of the extent of a nuclear winter has transformed. It is a much more grave matter than we knew in the 1980s when it was first sort of promulgated. But at this point, the danger is vastly greater. I can just leave it at that. So we're talking about the possibility in an all-out exchange of destroying undoubtedly all mammal life on the planet, and potentially a great deal more than that.
You know, I got the email from Martha saying that you all were available to do a podcast, and so I jumped in my car and I ran home and jumped on Skype. But I was coming from a 1-year-old's birthday party with the monkeys and the elephants and it was just so fun, and balloons everywhere, and he was smashing the cake into his face, and I was like, how am I going to get myself out of this mentally, this 1-year-old's birthday party, and transition into like nuclear weapons? But if you think about it, it's really not that hard. I mean, if we're thinking about the future of the planet and what we want this world to look like for him when he's 25 or 50 or 75, it's not that much of a transition at all.
So you recognize this as a joyous.
and that's beautiful, Ellen, that you did that. Thank you.
And we're trying to do that, make the world a better place for that 1-year-old, and we're letting the cat out of the bag today with regard to the truth and the lies that we're surrounded by every day. You can also follow the Kings Bay Plowshares on Facebook. You guys have a great Facebook feed. So I really recommend that. It keeps you informed about the nuclear issue, what's going on. I'm also going to link to Martha and Claire's podcast that you guys did with Jack Gilroy. And I was going to title this Nonviolent Direct Action. Do you remember that one? Anyway.
It was Ellen and myself, actually. Ellen interviewed me.
Oh, she did. Claire, didn't you do one with Jack?
I did one with Jack alone, yes.
Okay, yeah, because I was going to title this podcast Gangster Grannies.
That's what the women called us when we went into the Glen County
Ellen
jail.
is abreast of all of this because she's been doing her homework. She's been looking at all the podcasts.
I know. Carmen is going to ruin that for me. Now I can't call it Gangster Grannies. But can you explain where that came from real quick? I love that.
The Woodbine County Jail in Georgia. That's what the women, our fellow inmates, dubbed us immediately.
Because they said, why are you here? And you said, we were protesting nuclear weapons. And they said, Gangster Grannies.
So we said we went into Kings Bay where the Trident is.
But those are really great interviews too.
They had seen it. When we went into the Camden County Jail for the first time, there was a little silence, and then people were asking us if we were the guys that were on TV.
Really?
They had seen us on the news in the cell block.
Oh, that's great.
They're like, are you the guys that went to?
That's pretty cool. Well, yeah, I loved those podcasts and hearing the stories from what it was like to be in jail, and it seemed like you were doing some ministry, when you were there. It was really beautiful stories that came out of that. I would encourage anybody who's listening to subscribe to the Catholic Worker newspaper. Carmen, aren't you the editor? Did we fail to mention that?
Martha and I are both editors. Yeah, did I fail to mention it? Sure.
Oh yeah, I might have failed to mention it. Like I said, I had the 1-year-old's birthday party on my mind when we started this. But subscribe to the Catholic Worker newspaper, and I would also encourage anybody who's listening to go visit an intentional community, a Catholic worker community in your state. They're notoriously hospitable. They will welcome anyone, and they'll feed you for free. And you can just go in there and you can talk to the Catholic workers, and you will get an education like nothing else. So I would recommend that people do that as well. Is there anything that you'd like to say that we haven't covered so far?
Read Dorothy Day and the Long Loneliness.
Yes, Dorothy Day. I had you sign that book, Martha, when I met you at Agape. And I said, will you sign this for me? And you said, I don't know if I feel right signing a book that my grandmother wrote. And I was like, oh, please. And you were like, okay. And you did it. But yeah, The Long Loneliness is a classic for sure. Anything else?
If we really got started with other things, Ellen, we'd be here a lot longer.
It's true. And you guys are on curfew. Well,
Next conversation with you.
All right. God bless you for everything you're doing. Thank you for being with me on this podcast and just for everything you're doing. And I wish you the best of luck. I hope everything turns out well.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
And blessings to your viewers or your
Take
listeners.
care.
You're coming to the trial, of course.
Oh, whenever it is.
We'll let you know.
Let me know. I would love to be there. I did read that book about the other trial with Megan Rice,
Yeah.
Almighty. That was a good book too. So maybe I'll come to your trial and I'll write a book about that one.
Whoa. Look at that.
Take care, you guys. Thanks again.
Okay.
Adios.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.